We'll start with introductions. And so first I'll say welcome everyone who's here and those shortly to join to our Transit Center Calculation Model review. Very excited to welcome you today. I'm Casey McPherson. I'm the Senior Planner with the Department of Local Affairs, Division of Local Government, and have been very pleased to be working with our partner agencies and others here on some projects that we get to release and start getting feedback on. So we're going to start here with introductions. And so I will pass it off, Kelly, to you, and then the ECHO team next, please.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Kelly Blinn. I'm a policy advisor on land use and transportation with the Colorado Energy Office, and I've been working with Casey and team at DOLA and our interagency team on implementing some of these land use and housing laws that were passed by the legislature this past session. And we have here today also our consulting team helping us with this particular project, ECHO Northwest. So I'll pass it to Ian to introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Ian Carlton, Project Director on this, supporting DOLA and the implementation of the TOC program, and I'll pass it to Madeline.
Hi, everyone. My name is Madeline Miller. I'm a Senior Project Manager at ECHO Northwest, supporting the team. James.
Hello, everyone. My name is James Kim, a project manager here, but also supporting the technical analysis and the tool development. I'll have a speaking role there in half an hour.
Wonderful, thanks. And for those of you joining, if you could please change your names if you need to reflect who you are, who you're with, and add that in the chat if you would. We're excited to get to the demonstration, so we'll go ahead and do intros by way of chat. So go ahead and start doing that. And Kelly, if you'd like to share screen, I think we're ready. Thank you. The chats are coming in. Thanks, everyone. Okay, I'm not yet seeing the visual. Is that just me or are we all still waiting? Okay, there we go. Thank you, Kelly. Okay, again, welcome to the Transit Center Calculation Model Review. Next slide. We are working on introductions now. So just for those who just joined, we just said hello from the state team and consultant team at ECHO Northwest. And for those in the audience, please put your name and who you're with in the chat. Today, we're going to go through what the webinar purpose. We'll talk about the Transit Center Calculation Model purpose as well as the timeline to continue development of that and release it. The public comment period, we're going to do a live demonstration and have Q&A at the end. If you do have clarifying questions along the way, I believe we're good to put those in the chat. Is that still correct? Thank you. Okay. So if you have clarifying questions along the way, please do feel free to submit those in the chat and know that we're going to have Q&A time at the end. Next slide. Okay, so here is our purpose today. I'm very excited to say we're going to demonstrate how this draft calculation model works so that you'll know how to test it and how to provide feedback. On that point, we'll also demonstrate how and when to provide public comment and answer any early questions you have here at the beginning reacting to this calculation model. So we're very much looking forward to getting your feedback on this and making refinements based on that. So that's where I will stop as far as the purpose, because now it's time to get into some serious detail. So I'll hand it over to Kelly Blinn with the Energy Office.
Great, thanks, Casey. And I'm still somewhat doing a bit of an overview or intro before passing it to the ECHO Northwest team. And for those of you who have been to our other meetings on this topic, a few of these slides will be familiar, but we did want to review kind of why we're here today, what we're focused on. So the TOC law does direct the state to create this transit center calculation model in order to interpret the density and dimensional standards in the law and to provide simple and efficient methods for local governments to calculate the net housing density of their transit centers as they're working towards meeting the housing opportunity goal. So this is just some of the language from statute that's directing us in this work. This slide is just a reminder of our overall TOC law timeline in 2024 and 2025. So this may be familiar to you all. We worked on the transit area mapping earlier this year, and now we're really focused on this calculation model development with a lot of input opportunities this fall and winter prior to finalizing in February. And simultaneously, we've begun developing parts of the overall TOC guidance manual, since there's different components to the law. And so we published the first couple sections, kind of an overview of the whole law last month, and we'll be rolling out additional sections as they're ready, also aiming to publish that full guidance at the end of February. And then ongoing discussions and technical assistance with local governments and DOLA as needed in these months prior to kind of the first deadline for local governments being the preliminary TOC assessment report in the middle of next year. Just a reminder of some of the other resources that we've put out so far and where to find those. The Engage DOLA site has kind of become our hub for sharing and publishing both final and draft resources for comment. And so these are a couple of the other resources that have already been published. That first link is just a summary of the law on the DOLA website. Then we have the maps, designated transit areas, and other designations in the law, as well as data and shape files that you can download. And the first two parts of the TOC law guidance published last month that I mentioned. So that can all be found on Engage DOLA. So I wanted to get into a bit more detail about the two tools and accompanying user guides that we've just published for public comment. So they are different, but obviously interrelated in certain ways. So the first tool is the Housing Opportunity Goal Calculation tool. And the purpose of that one is really to provide consistent guidance and format to identify and report on exempt parcels and calculate the housing opportunity goal, leading up to that preliminary HOG report that I mentioned on a previous slide. And so that draft spreadsheet tool has been published this week and is out for public comment through the middle of December. And we'll be working to finalize that tool by the end of February. And then the second tool, which we'll be mostly talking about today, is the Transit Center Calculation Model and User Guide, which is sort of the next step to the law. Once you've calculated your housing opportunity goal, this next tool will help designate your transit centers and understand what the net housing density and zoning capacity of those transit centers are. So that tool and accompanying user guide is also out for public comment on the same schedule. And if anyone wants to put these links in the chat, that would be great. These are up on the Engage DOLA site where you can find all these resources. So this is the link to the Housing Opportunity Goal resources. And on that page, you'll find an Excel spreadsheet tool that you can download and test, putting in your data and seeing how it works, seeing if you have feedback for us. There's accompanying step-by-step guidance in the linked Google Doc for how to use the tool. And then coming soon, we'll give more information about this. We're working on providing a parcel data set that jurisdictions can work with some exemptions in the law already marked, like floodplains and the walkshed exemptions. Optional to use if that's of interest, but we will be putting that out in the next week. So we encourage you to check out this tool. We're asking folks to try it out and give us feedback by December 16th. Hopefully that's enough time to at least, if not complete it, at least try it out with some of your data and give us some initial thoughts on it. We didn't have enough time today to go through both tools. We do have our Friday monthly meeting this week and plan to do a live walkthrough of this kind of simpler spreadsheet tool at that meeting. And we will post that recording on the Engage DOLA site as a kind of walkthrough to help folks who are trying to test it out. So more to come on that one. And then we have the transit center calculation model draft, which we'll spend quite a bit more time on today. Here's the link to where you can find all the resources that you'll need to dig in more on this, both the Excel spreadsheet and the Google Doc, as well as a link to a form where you can submit your comments. You're also welcome to email us if you'd like to just meet and talk through it. We welcome that. And there's also an option to actually upload your spreadsheet. We'd love to, see how it's working and, go through it with you if that's of interest. Okay, other considerations, just as we get into talking through this. We did want to emphasize that the law directs DOLA to create this transit center model to interpret the density and dimensional standards in the law, which we think is really important for consistency and fairness in how we interpret and implement the law. So our intention is not to make it required for jurisdictions to only use this model in designating transit centers, but our goal is to make it a straightforward way for most jurisdictions to designate transit centers and demonstrate compliance and kind of have this be a common format for most folks to use. So we really want to encourage everyone to try it out in this public comment period and give us feedback, since the assumptions behind the model and interpretations of how to calculate density will be important for establishing consistency across all the jurisdictions where the law applies. Also just wanted to say there's some things that we haven't yet addressed in this version. Some of the edge cases out there, we know everyone, has some unique parts of their zoning. And so we encourage you to give us feedback on those things too. So we've listed a few things out in the feedback form, in the guidance, things like form-based codes, density bonuses, large parcels that will be subdivided. Another thing that comes to mind is some of the work that you'll need to do in GIS ahead of time to be able to bring your data into this tool. Any of that guidance or support that you're looking for, we encourage you to give us feedback on that too. And as always, to please reach out to us if you need access to certain documents, if you're have any barriers to that or want to meet to discuss the drafts with us, please feel free to reach out to our team. So I think with that, I'm passing it over to Ian to start walking through the user guide and then ultimately the model. And yeah, pass it on to Ian.
Great, thank you, Kelly. So we'll start off just by covering a few essential items that can be found in the user guide. And if we go to the next slide, we're going to point out 4 primary components. First of all, as you go to the guide, you'll find interpretive guidance. And this is how the law was interpreted with descriptions of each key term for the purposes of creating the calculation model. We also have baseline assumptions that flow through all of the calculations in the model. Those are inputs that can be adjusted, and we want to call your attention to those. Another key feature of the model will be the subdistrict inputs, and we'll cover what those are in more detail and show you how one can input those momentarily. And ultimately, the outputs of the model are driven off of site-level inputs. And so those site-level inputs are described on page 42 of the guidance. Very important to understand how you would input different sites into the tool and then see a net housing density and a zoning capacity calculated for the sites. All right. So what I want to do now is actually walk you through that guidance that you can find online. As we noted before, you should be able to find that on the DOLA website. There are 2 links, one to the calculation model itself that you can download as a spreadsheet, and we'll walk you through that shortly. The other is a draft user guide you can click on this link and it will open up the user guide. And the user guide for the calculation model is found in section 2 of this document. And section 2 consists of several subsections, starting off with how one would use the user guide itself to be able to implement the calculation model for your jurisdiction and your transit centers. And as you are considering how you would interpret transit centers and the TOC law, we've provided our interpretation of that here in a section on interpretive guidance. So this is where we've taken elements of the law and outlined how they were interpreted for the purposes of the calculations in the calculation model. So this is important information and great background if you have any questions about the interpretation, about the definitions, about the law itself. So that starts on page 20 and is a good resource to refer back to. Then in section 2.3, we talk about the model itself in more detail. And for each element within the model, we have a section here. We've broken it out by worksheet, and this is by Excel worksheet. So those are the tabs across the bottom of the Excel file. And those sort of work in dividing up the process as well as the material in a linear fashion. So you start with an about page. You then have jurisdictional information that you fill in a second worksheet. Then you have on worksheet 3, baseline assumptions. As I said, these baseline assumptions really get into some of the key assumptions that flow through all of the calculations in the calculation model. And this describes each of those inputs and how they can be adjusted. It's here in the user guide, easy to follow along with the Excel spreadsheet, which parallels this format, worksheet by worksheet. There's also a worksheet description here for worksheet 4, which is the sub-district inputs. This is the worksheet in Excel where you would input information about geographies in your jurisdiction that have unique limiting factors for zoned capacity. So those would be land use controls, dimensional standards that would inform how many units could be built on any given site. And we describe in this worksheet user guide what the worksheet is intended to do, providing an overview here, and all of the user inputs and how you would go about inputting information into each cell of the spreadsheet. Each column of the spreadsheet is described in greater detail here, and all of these titles correspond with a column that you'll find in the spreadsheet itself. So if you're looking at the spreadsheet and you have a question about a particular input, you can always refer back here to the guide, and it could give you a bit more detail. So this is for sub-districts, and then worksheet 5 is another really important one, which is your site inputs. And there's a good bit of information to be provided by the user, but substantially more information on this worksheet that is automatically calculated. And so we provide descriptions of what the user would input, and then also that's here in blue, optional items in green, and then there's a description here of inputs that you could provide into each of these. So again, this guide is intended to be parallel structure to the actual calculation model in Microsoft Excel so that you can easily refer back and forth. Most of the instructions will be found here in the guide, and the user will be spending a lot of time in Excel preparing to put things into Excel and referring back to this written guide. I want to go back and cover one topic with a little bit more detail before we share with you the actual Excel model and provide some some examples of how you could input information. Sub-districts are an essential input into this model. They're not necessarily something that we see out in the wild. This is something that we have created for the purposes of inputting information into this spreadsheet. And once I explain it to you, I hope it is easy for you to understand that it is an interpretation of what your zoning code or your planned unit developments or your development agreements already stipulate. But we've provided a way for you to input that in a very clear manner in the spreadsheet. Now, the transit center subdistricts are a set of distinct dimensional restrictions that will apply to multiple sites, to a site or multiple sites within your transit centers. Now, these could be your zone districts, or it could be subsets of your zone districts. As we described in a previous session on this topic, an example of this might be a zoning district where corner lots are provided slightly different dimensional standards than mid-block lots. Both have the same zoning designation, but they are treated differently. So one might create a subdistrict for that zone called corners and another subdistrict called mid-block, and that would allow you to distinguish the zoned capacity on sites that are within the same zone but are treated differently within that same zone. So that's just one example of many, and we'll cover some more of those. But you'll need to input this information into the calculation model, which we expect you're going to be doing a lot of this work outside of the actual Excel calculation model. You'll be doing this in GIS. You'll be doing this with your zoning code PDFs open on your screens. But you'll need to input the information in rows for each subdistrict into the Excel model. Ultimately, the reason to do this is that all sites will become associated with a transit center subdistrict identifier in the model. That will tell the model what dimensional standards, what net housing density or zoned capacity to associate with that site. To go and give you another example, let's go to the next slide. We'll try and make this more concrete by showing you visually what we're talking about. If you can imagine this representation of your zoning map, you have a lot of parcels. Those are those yellow boxes up there at the top. And then the yellow boxes or parcels on your zoning map are associated with different land use controls, which might be a zoning district designation, a PUD, any number of land use controls could be applied to any of these parcels. In this case, this example we've provided, we have a handful of different PUD and zoning districts that are mapped to these parcels. Now, DOLA has provided for you a set of information regarding their transit area qualification. Basically, are they within transit areas? So that's the next slide, where we layer on this information, and probably you're going to do this in GIS, where the transit area is defined, and also the law stipulates that one could assign parcels that are in a buffer outside of the transit area to your transit centers. Beyond the buffer, let's assume that that's outside of your transit area, and one has options for bringing those into the transit centers. But for the purposes of this one, we're going to think about your jurisdiction, imagine your jurisdiction contemplating what part of the transit area and the buffer will be included in your transit center calculations. And that's the next slide, where we layer in a definition that you as a jurisdiction will define what's in your transit center and what's out of your transit center. In this example, On the left-hand side, Zone T might be a low-intensity zoning district that wouldn't meet the minimum required net housing density, and so it will be left out of the transit center calculations. And in this particular example, imagine the jurisdictions defining the transit centers as including a lot of area in the buffer, a quarter mile outside of the transit area. And that would encompass Zone Y. Now, in this case, Zone Y is present in two forms inside of the transit centers. There's Zone Y that's a special case, let's say corner lots, and there's Zone Y that's a typical case, let's say mid-block lots. Well, we, in calculating the zoned capacity for these parcels, would want to treat those differently. And so what we ask of you is that you think about these as distinct transit center subdistricts, which is the next slide, the next layer of this, which is that you would define Zone Y, the special case, as one transit center subdistrict. You have dimensional standards in PUDX that you would define for transit center subdistrict 2. And then you have Zone Y, some parcels in Zone Y that are a special case, or a typical case, excuse me, which you would associate with transit center subdistrict 3. So a lot of this work will be taking place outside of any of the calculation model Excel that we provided you. It would potentially take place in GIS or another analytical tool or in Maps. But ultimately, on the next slide, you'll see what we are hoping that you can be prepared to input into the calculation model, into the Excel, is information about the series of transit center subdistricts and information about all of the relevant parcels and sites that are associated with those transit center subdistricts. And that is how the Excel will ultimately calculate how much zoned capacity exists on all those yellow parcels inside your transit centers based on the dimensional restrictions and zone capacity, the net housing density associated with each of the transit center subdistricts. All right, so next slide. Key to the subdistricts is that each of these will need to be defined in the Excel as a different row in the spreadsheet, and each row should have a unique name. You'll define it one time on the subdistrict's inputs, and once you've done that, you'll be able to associate parcels and sites with those subdistricts on the Site Inputs tab. Now, it's very hard to imagine this unless you look at the tool, and so I think now is a good time to hand this over to James, who will share with you the tool itself.
Thanks, Ian. He's explained it. He's shown images of it. Now I'm going to show the tool and how it applies. So when you open up the draft model that is available online, you'll see this. You might actually have a different name once you download it from the website. But I want to introduce you first to the tabs or the worksheets on the bottom. You will notice immediately there are some that have this lock button indicating there are many portions of the worksheets that are locked and not able to be changed. I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes walking through what each one of them are, what each of them is, before diving more into the three things that Ian was talking about: the baseline assumptions, which is really applies across all the geographies, the sub-districts and the inputs for those, and then the site inputs. This first tab is explaining to you what this tool is, and it's important to look at what this legend is. This legend you will also continue to see in each of the sheets, but in the blue is required user data inputs. You'll notice that it says where applicable. For example, you might have a zoning district where there is no height restriction. Then you could, even though it's a required input, you could keep it out. You could keep it empty. The green is optional. This, what I see as a orange-ish color, is a calculated cell. It's a calculation in the model. You will not be able to edit those. And then another type of calculation is this pink cell, which is referencing other cells in the tool. Finally, there are two outputs to pay attention to: net housing density, which is a units per acre output, and a zoning capacity, which is a total number of zone units. In the second tab, we ask you to provide some information about yourself when you're submitting data with this tool. Baseline assumptions, here are several assumptions or variables that do not change in the model. They are fixed values, but we do provide an option for you to change, provide alternate values, and I'll come back to this in just a little bit. Fourth one is sub-district inputs. Transit center sub-districts, they're unique geographies for the purpose of this tool. You don't have to rezone something to a transit sub-district. This is where you define them in the tool, and this work will relate to some other work you will do ahead of time to GIS, we imagine. But you're also going to spend time here to make sure that your transit center sub-districts are properly defined. The site inputs and capacity calculation, this is where you enter information about the sites. The sites could be parcels, or they could be groups of parcels. And each site has to relate to a transit center sub-district. I'll scroll over just a bit here to show you that you see some blue cells that are required, some green cells that are optional. At the end of the first section, we have key outputs, the net housing density and zoning capacity. Over to the right of this is a bunch of columns that you are able to see but not edit. These are the calculations that take all of your inputs and generate the net housing density and zoning capacity numbers. They go all the way, as you can see, it's an extensive model. They go all the way to column CC. However, to make this easier for you, we have it open for you to see. You can see it, but we don't require to see it. If you really didn't want to bother, you could stop here at column U where the outputs are. 6th tab summarizes the outputs by the transit center sub-districts. And then the 7th one is, this is a table of assumptions that feed into our parking related calculations. We explained this in the user guide, but we will not be coming back to this during the webinar. And then finally, we have been considering different ways of complying with the law that is not using the 7 tabs developed in the tool, but maybe there's an alternate way. We're open to hearing about that during this public comment period. And if we find that there is a method that is common to more than one jurisdiction and it will be useful to include in the tool, we're reserving the space to include that here. Now, opening back up to this baseline assumptions, I want to explain to you what each one of these is. I'm gonna go to view and do an unfreeze pane just so that I can scroll a little bit more easily. Come back here. I'm gonna freeze it right there. The first two really has to do with the idea that with very large parcels, you would not expect reasonably all of the parcel to be developed or have zoned capacity. For example, you might see a public road right of way or an easement taken out when that lot is subdivided for development. Or you might have public land dedication requirements. Here, as a baseline assumption, we say that threshold when that policy or that assumption kicks in is 1 acre. Lots greater than 1 acre will have this applied. And as a baseline assumption, we have that ratio or that percentage at 0%. So in effect, These two values don't do anything to adjust your developable parcel size. If you wanted to use this, if you had a use case for your jurisdictions, you could change that. Coming up here to the right, alternate assumption, maybe you decide that sites 3 acres and bigger should be treated with this. And then when I put that in, you will see this alternate assumption reason cell is changed. It changed color to blue. I'm gonna undo and redo it just to show again. And remember, the blue cell means it's a required cell. We require it to provide some reasoning for providing value of 3 here. And then down here, you might say 15% is my set aside amount. And again, you would have to provide a reasoning before this value is taken into, this value takes effect. Average unit size is the leasable unit size of a typical building. The law requires some assumption about that. In fact, you asked us really to use the U.S. Census Bureau's American Housing Survey data to come up with this data point. Even within it, there's some selections that we could have made and some decisions that we made. We ended up with this value, and you could provide a different value here as well. You could provide a different assumption and reasoning for that. That average unit size is different from a gross unit size. Gross unit size includes kind of the hallways, elevator, stairs, lobby, common areas, so that even if a typical unit's 850 square feet, the gross unit might be closer to 1,000 square feet. And that the difference between the two is based on something called gross to net conversion factor in this tool. This 85% ratio is saying this 998.12 is 85%, or multiplying that by 85% gets you to the average unit size here. The last two assumptions that apply across all the sites in the model is the surface parking area. That is 325 square feet. You might be thinking that's big, and that's because this includes the circulation portion of the parking area, not just the physical size of a length and width of a car. Finally, lot depth to lot width ratio is an assumption about if you have a site size, what is the ratio of the lot depth to lot width. And that could matter, or that really matters only when you're thinking about setbacks and its effect on zoned capacity. Moving on to the fourth worksheet, sub-district inputs. You'll notice the one value that is available by default, and actually this row cannot be changed. This is a special case of a sub-district that we have provided to be used for sites that have negotiated or contractual density or capacity limits, where a dimensional restriction you would be essentially saying that dimensional restriction is not applicable here because we have other numbers, other density or capacity numbers we've agreed to. So this type of sub-district you could assign to parcels where this is the case. I'm gonna provide some examples of sub-districts you could start putting in here. So maybe you have a residential district, let's call it R2 district, and this is a low to medium density zone, residential zone, and you can say this has a max height of 3, parking ratio 1 per unit. You can choose between different types of residential uses. Maybe this one allows up to triplexes, so I select 3 units. And on, entering in information about the transit center subdistrict, which in this example is actually a zoning district. But as Ian was saying, you might have a corner lot associated with it. And you might have almost all the same information, and you could explain this has to do with corner lots, and maybe your corner lots allow more than 3 units. So choosing other single family could be something you do. I'm gonna just copy over some values that I've created in advance. So on the R2 lots, one thing I wanted to point out is, sorry, not R2 lots. The next one, MNT lot, mixed-use neighborhood transit zoning district. In this one, what I did want to point out is that I have entered here front setback as 0 feet, but maybe your MNT district requires a frontage requirement for the 60% of the frontage. That is not a feature handled in the model, so you can make a note of that in this other significant restrictions and notes section. Another item to point out is I have a 2.5 side setback. So what I did there is, depending on conditions, you might have a 0 feet setback or 5 feet setback. You might choose to average and put 2.5 in here, or you might choose to put 0 in there instead, or 5 instead. In those decision points, I think it would be prudent to explain those in this notes section. I have created here another one called MNT_HB 1304. 1304 is the minimum parking requirements law around transit areas. So this I was also thinking of it as more of an overlay to MNT transit district. So as Ewan was explaining, you might create a special case of your zoning district that relates to parking in this instance, and give it a new subdistrict ID, subdistrict name. Finally, we know that there are form-based or modular codes in Colorado. So how you might enter that is put in a name here. Again, this can be your zoning district name or a unique name. You could explain what that is. In this example, it is limited or controlled by 3 floors of height. Maybe there's a parking requirement related to it. Multifamily is the highest density of residential allowed. But then many or all of the other dimensional restrictions available in the tool don't apply. Then you could keep it empty, or you could enter 0 as your dimensional restriction. The tool was designed to handle work with either the empty cells or 0 cells. And this is where, even though these are blue cells that are quote unquote required cells, you may enter 0 because it is not applicable to your jurisdiction or applicable to your zoning district. Moving on to the 5th tab. Here, the first 3 columns, let me move on over and actually unfreezes and reorganizes for visual purposes. I'm gonna do a split. If you didn't know about this, you could split your screen in multiple ways. And then what I do want to keep on the right side is the outputs. So I want to show you first these 3. Your inputs into these 3 columns will not affect the calculations that happen in the model, but this is to help with the compliance process. So letting DOLA know whether your site is a transit area, right? And it might be a parcel, and then you might give it an ID. It could be an actual APN number if it's a parcel that has an APN. Alternatively, it's not in a transit area, but it is in a buffer area. Again, it's a parcel, give it a different ID. And then third option is that it's not either transit area or buffer, but it's optional transit area. and then give you an idea as well. One thing to note here is that even though there is no check around this, your parcel or your site should only belong or be associated with one of these three categories. Again, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, we just have a couple clarifying questions in the chat. I'll go ahead and read one. If there was an estimate for the amount of time it takes to fill in subdistrict info, and generally the time it will take to compile and fill in the subdistrict information will depend on the complexity of the local code and the regulating policies. So we recommend filling in a few rows and see how long it takes. And that's an exercise that could be done outside the calculation model and should be done by people interpreting, who are capable of interpreting a zoning code. But that is a piece of feedback we'd be interested in receiving on the code on the tool. And then just another clarification. The guidance suggests that you leave a non-applicable cell blank. So James, you did mention putting in a 0, and I think the model will treat it either way, but we would suggest following the guidance. So I'll just leave those 2 clarifications there.
Thank you. And thank you for monitoring the chat. I see messages coming, but I cannot read those, or not easily. Assuming there aren't any more comments through chats, questions through chats, I'm going to move on to the 5th, or continue on with this tab. And to save a little bit of time, I did pre-populate some of these cells, so I'm copying and pasting it over here. The 4th row is a large parcel, a parcel that is 5 acres. And comparing these 2 rows, they're both in transit area, they're both parcels. They're only different by their site size. Why does that matter? Why does that matter? It matters later on in the calculations, later in the tool. In column O, there's going to be a column titled instructions. And for this parcel or a site that is greater than 5 acres, you're going to get a different instruction about having an option to enter the target net housing density. The law talks about giving this option a target net housing density for lots greater than 5 acres. So that's the key difference there. And if you choose to, you can enter a target net housing density in the next column. The 5th row available here, again, is in a transit area. And here I want to show you a use case for selecting multi-parcel site as your site category. This could be a PUD. It could be a group of parcels in your transit center within a single zoning district. This could be your entire zoning district within that transit center, right? So there are a few use cases where you're not talking about a single parcel, but you want to input an entire category of parcels in here. Here I took essentially 10 acres is what I assigned to it. I want to run through the next few columns, and I think I have about 10 minutes left here. Transit Center Subdistrict ID is where you assign each of these sites to the subdistricts you've created in the previous tab. You have all of these options available. These options match what's available in the previous tab. So I can assign this first one to R2, for example. And, before I did that, sorry, I wanted to have the outputs at the end showing. So right now, this row with 10,000 square feet, a parcel has no other input. It has 0 net housing density, 0 zoning capacity. If I send an R2 transit center subdistrict, which happens to look like a zoning district, if I assign that to this parcel, now will be assigned a 13 units per acre for its net housing density. But the zoning capacity doesn't change. It's 0. What gives? That's because the law limits the net housing density to be between 15 and 500. This 13.1 is below 15, so ultimately there's no zoning capacity outputting. But the next 10,000 square feet parcel, I'm going to make it R2 corner. Now that is a 17.4 DUA, dwelling units per acre, and it now has 4 units associated with that 10,000 square feet. I'm going to come over to this existing units column. The law also talks about the ability to indicate how many units are already on your sites, and regardless of the zone capacity, if you have those buildings there, those should count. So the calculator says 4 units, but maybe there are already 5 units on that corner lot, so you put that in there. And that 5 now overrides the 4 that was outputting before. Next, for this large 5-acre parcel, 250,000 square feet, I want to try putting the MNT Transit Center Subdistrict with it. It gives me 139 dwellings per acre, 679 units. But maybe part of that 250,000 square feet is not developable for whatever reason. So you enter 50,000 here as an example value. When I press enter here, the cell next to it changed to blue again. If I enter 50,000, sorry, 50,000, the cell next to it changed to blue, and you've provided an undevelopable area, and now the tool is requiring you to provide a reason for why you are providing 50,000 square feet as your undevelopable area. Here, the zoning capacity 577 square feet. Now, what if there's a column for applicability of the minimum parking law. What if I turned it on? Or I guess, let me try the no first, because that's really what's being assumed, right? No, didn't change anything. What if I tried yes? That number now goes up. It was with a no, 577 square feet. But by indicating to the tool that the minimum parking law is applicable here, it increases the zoning capacity. Now, it doesn't do that every time. The zoning capacity doesn't go up every time you make a yes here. It is in this specific instance based on the parcel information, site information, and the sub-district information about current parking requirements. It appears to me that the parking requirements were a restricting factor to the zoning capacity, and the minimum parking law essentially makes that a 0 per unit, and that increases the zoning capacity. Finally, this multi-parcel site, that one I want to associate it with this custom density and capacity I mentioned about earlier. That is a site where you might have a negotiated agreement, or it might be a PUD where it's PUDs can be governed by zoning this dimensional restrictions, but some are not. And let's say it is not in this case. So you select custom density capacity. What that does is that you're not going to have, that alone means you're not having any net housing density, zoning capacity, but you need to provide more information. This instructions cell was an optional one before, and now says it's required. Let me zoom in a little bit more. It's required the target net housing density or target zoning capacity, which are the two next to cells, must have a value. Let me zoom back out again. I didn't want to lose my outputs. So here, let me try putting in 100 dwelling units per acre. That outputs zoning capacity of 850. The net housing density, this is a calculated net housing density based on dimensional restrictions, and there being none, it actually says it's 0 dwelling units per acre. but the zoning capacity is now informed by this 100 units per acre that a user would provide. And then maybe there's a target zoning capacity on top of that. Maybe that target is 1,000 units. Well, that didn't change that 850 because what the calculator thinks about is which one of these two are the more restricting, which one results in the smaller number. Instead, if I put in 800, right, that 850 comes down to 800 because that 800 is more restrictive. And finally, if I deleted this first one, let's say dwelling use per acre was not a target density, was not a number that was available for that PUD, then the target zoning capacity of 800 is what informs the output. With that, I'm gonna actually end here because I think there will be questions. If there were more questions about form-based code, I do have another example prepared for that. So yes, I'll take questions for the next, I think, 20 or so minutes.
James, while folks are asking questions or raising hands, do you want to just flip to the output section just so you can maybe show if people want to look at it in a sort of summarized view once you're done? There's obviously not a lot of sites input here, but this is where you could look at an aggregate level. Yeah, what's going on in each subdistrict.
And James, quickly, I'll just note there are no other chat questions in the chat. So we'll wait if anyone has anything they want to ask live. And we have a question in the chat. How are height bonuses handled?
Yes, and I think Kelly and Ian also note this too, but we've talked about this, especially related to affordable housing and density bonuses and height bonuses. For at least the time being, what we've written in the user guide has to do, talks about essentially your base zoning, what is allowed, what is permitted without conditional uses or conditional actions.
And I can add that too. I mean, I think on one of the early slides we referenced that as like one of the questions still open to discussion. James is right that the model doesn't necessarily talk about that either way, but we kind of want to talk to folks who have like an affordable housing density bonus, and understand better how often that gets used. And maybe there's some way to work in a factor. But that's just me kind of taking a guess at maybe one way it could work, but we definitely want feedback on that question. Because yeah, as James said, it's not incorporated in the model right now.
And if you were to provide any information about that, the sub-district inputs might be the best place for it, where you might choose to define a sub-district based on a bonus if you choose to, but you'll have to explain very clearly that this is a bonus, and why you think that makes more sense. But if not, as a default, we would encourage you to use the base zoning values.
Yeah. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. So this is Kurt with Denver. I asked that question. I've been typing my questions because last time I was in one of these meetings, my headphones didn't work. So I would be interested in having a discussion on the height bonuses, just from a policy perspective. I wouldn't want an unintended consequence of the implementation of this law to basically eliminate a bonus. Like you could, if the result is, let's say you have a height bonus in a zone district, and in order to comply with this law, you have to increase the height. It's possible that there's a scenario where that height bonus loses its value and isn't really relevant anymore. And the unintended consequence could be you actually don't have any incentives for affordable housing anymore. So I would encourage kind of thinking, I don't know, a little strategically on how to incorporate that into the model.
Yep, it's a really good point. And we had, I think, conversations with one jurisdiction about this. We said the affordable housing height bonus gets used quite a bit as far as the overall percentage of, projects that are built. So that would be evidence towards probably, more credit for that. But that's what we would like input on.
A next question I see on the chat has to do with the number of rows. It's a very good point. On the sub-district inputs, I want to start there. It goes up to row 207, and in effect, it's 200 rows of sub-districts. We don't think anyone has more than 200 zoning districts, but it is possible because of these kind of iterations of across your zoning district, you might end up with more than 200 sub-districts in your transit centers. Hopefully not, but we have it made available up to 200. And then on the sites, we have it up to 10,000 sites. It goes up to row 10,008. Again, your city definitely has more than 10,000 parcels, but within your transit centers, not just within your transit areas, but the parcels you designate as transit centers. Let us know if you think you might have more than 10,000 parcels and you need this expanded. The trade-off there was that the file getting too big was difficult to share and open, so we limited to 10,000 for this draft.
And James and Kelly, there's actually one more question in the chat about ADU determination.
Let me read that sample.
It's I'll read it out loud for the recording. Has a determination on ADUs been provided? Do they count towards the density? For example, one house at 7.5 dwelling units per acre. One house with an ADU would be 15 dwelling units per acre.
Yeah, thank you for that question, Carl. Within the allowed residential uses, I didn't dwell on it during the earlier portion, but there are 5 options. Single unit is single detached unit, really. 2 units is more broadly defined to be duplexes, single family with an ADU, and ADU that might be attached or detached. 3 units is a triplex, or I think it could also be a single family, traditional single family development with 2 ADUs perhaps. And then the other single family is kind of catch-all phrase for townhouses, row houses, things that are what some of you might think of as middle housing space. And then multifamily is everything else that's more dense than that. We do describe in the user guide about this, that 2 units could be used for ADUs as well, a single ADU within single family unit.
One thing that's also probably good to note that the user guide goes into is we know in some zoning districts, you might allow multiple different types of residential uses. And in general, you're going to want to input the highest density residential use and the dimensional standards associated with that. So if a zone allows townhouses, but it also allows multifamily, you'll want to use multifamily most likely, and put in the height and setbacks and everything else that is associated with the multifamily use. So I imagine that makes sense to folks, and it's clearly written in the user guide, but just wanted to call that out when you're thinking about putting in these sub-districts.
Thanks, Kelly. That's actually what I was thinking about when I created this. And R2 zone might allow a single family and up to a triplex. Triplex or 3 units is the most dense option, so I'm choosing that. And then the minimum lot size per unit might be bigger for your single family unit, but in the same zone, in the same sub-district, your 3 units might have a lower number. So I think it would make sense to use that lower number for this case, the minimum lot size per unit.
Well, not seeing any other questions come through the chat or people coming off mute or raising their hands. Kelly, I don't know, is now a good time to wrap up? There are plenty of opportunities for people to provide additional questions and comments as they explore the tool and start playing with the data. We're certain that more things will come up.
Yeah, maybe we can give it a minute or two if folks are typing or thinking of questions. We know we've just put it out, so I know that folks may not have had a chance to look at this yet and are probably still digesting. But yeah, definitely encourage you to raise your hand now if any other questions come to mind. I think Ian may have mentioned it too. We do have a very lightly built out FAQs section at the end. I think we'll add some of the things we've heard today to those. As we hear other questions from you all during this comment period, we'll build that out more. But we just have a few things in there currently about, situations like overlays and, what zoning district sort of prevails is what you're going to want to put in, or mixed use districts, how you should handle those. And in some cases, I think the model will be able to handle those, and there might be other cases if you have a mixed use district where there might be certain restrictions or whatnot that we haven't yet built in. So I would say I would almost encourage folks to start with your simplest districts that you think can work as a transit center. Start there. Try putting in your dimensional restrictions and putting in the parcels that are associated with that district, and see what works, and then you can build up to some of maybe your more complex cases, but hopefully starting with the more straightforward approaches, you can kind of get the hang of it and tell us how long it takes you, so we can answer Kurt's question. Nathan, anything you would want to add before we wrap? I'm not seeing other hands or chats at the moment.
Nope. The only other thing I would say, I guess, well, I said no, but then I'm going to say something, is, really, we also want to hear, when you put in all of the dimensional restrictions and it spits out a number, does that number feel right to you for the density and the zoning capacity? Because again, I think we covered this earlier, but the law directs DOLA to interpret the density based on the model. So it'll be an important piece of this. So if that number feels off, too high or too low, would like to hear that as well. The other thing I was going to say, Kelly, if we have extra time, you could do the hog calculator tool, but I don't know if you want to get into that in 20 minutes.
I think I might save it for Friday, just so we can make sure we have time for questions and be well prepared.
Yeah, that's fair.
Rather than wing it.
Right. Get halfway through.
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, for folks who don't want to come to another meeting this week, we get it. We will record it. We'll post it to Engage DOLA, so you have a walkthrough of both. I think to Nathan's point too, as James did the walkthrough and showed sort of the calculation section, and Ian talked about the user guide, as you're looking at kind of what the net housing density or zoning capacity outputs of each transit center subdistrict, the guide goes into quite a bit more detail about how those calculations are being run based on your setbacks and your height and the parking, all the other restrictions. And so if you're having questions, certainly look there, reach out to us. We're happy to meet during this public comment period and talk through things with you all. We definitely want to hear as much feedback as we can. And I think I just have one last slide just to talk through our next steps, or just really reiterate things. But then we can close a little early if we don't have lots of questions. So our next steps, we'll post this recording this week, so you have it as another approach besides the user guide, if you want to share this with other colleagues or review it later. As we mentioned, the public comment period will close December 16th. Obviously, we can keep talking beyond that, but we're asking for comments by then so that we can work on the final draft by February 28th when it's due, based on the statute. We will be hosting some additional focus groups and meetings with test communities to keep getting more feedback and hear any input from folks who are testing it out. And then we'll be really taking the latter part of December and January and February to refine and finalize the transit center calculation model so that we can publish it by the end of February. So now is a great time to, even just a few districts, whichever many parcels you can put in, we would love to have your feedback. As we mentioned on the Engage DOLA site, you can also upload a draft spreadsheet if you put in some information, and we're happy to talk through it with you once you've done that. I think that's all I have. Madeline, anything else before we close?
Not from our team. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, thanks everyone for the time. We really appreciate it and look forward to hearing your feedback.
Thank you.